as we know in women's basketball, Tennessee and UConn was the rivalry that stopped the world for a long time. The funniest part about it, though, was the coaches at the heart of the rivalry did not like what it stood for and were both a little bit short-sighted. Geno Auriemma talked about what happened with the rivalry before the hiatus. And for those who don't remember, there was a hiatus between the 2007 series and when it was revived in 2020. He has gone out of his way to emphasize that the rivalry isn't what it once was, nor should it be. And in a recent interview with ESPN, which I think is just a ridiculous thing that he said something so utterly nonsensical that he doesn't even realize the importance of promoting a sport that he's been a part of for 30 years. He was asked about the rivalry and he said, quote, "It became something that wasn't normal," referring to the acrimony that grew between Tennessee fan bases, coaches, and programs. He continues, "It just became stupid and became something I didn't want to be a part of anymore. I think our fans are stupid. I think their fans are stupid and how they reacted to the whole thing. It just became something other than a basketball game, and after a while, it just got old." It's one of the dumbest statements anyone has ever said about the sport they coached. Okay. The women's basketball rivalry between Tennessee and UConn and the way it stopped the women's basketball world had a huge hand in promoting women's basketball as a sport. Remember, I mean, this is like saying that the Magic and Bird rivalry was stupid. Like, what? No, it wasn't. There was probably animosity back then. Some of you guys can quote me. I was born in the late 80s, so I didn't follow the Magic Bird rivalry. But I know enough history to know that it helped prop up the NBA to heights that it had never seen before, which led to the Dream Team, which led to Michael Jordan become the biggest global icon in the history of modern era professional sports, which created the way for LeBron and Kobe and all these other superstars. Now, the Magic and Bird rivalry did that. Yeah, elements of it were stupid. Unfortunately, it was somewhat racial. Okay, there were certain people that sided with Bird and certain people that sided with Magic, and it kind of became a bit of a who looks like you part, which is fine, though. It was okay. It was okay because it promoted the NBA, and it was good for everybody. How is Geno Auriemma going to sit there and say the Lady Vols UConn rivalry became stupid? Yeah, there was acrimony and hatred. Does he not know what college sports is about? College sports rivalries are stupid. People do stupid stuff, and then he acts like I didn't want to be a part of it anymore. That's just a dumb take and a dumb statement. And to act like it wasn't good for the sport is ridiculous. Killing it was bad for the sport. Killing it was terrible for the sport and actually delayed the growth of women's basketball. Because in the early 2000s, women's basketball was really pushing men's basketball for ratings in the NCAA tournament, and it fell apart. Now, a couple of things happened. At the time the rivalry ended, Tennessee had kind of resupplanted themselves as dominant over UConn. But then right after the rivalry ended, UConn became the dominant one. But it always came down to recruits. And narratives and storylines that have come since then are only known within Tennessee and UConn circles that could have been much more national, but they're not because of them ending the rivalry. Now, rest in peace, but I'm not here to let Pat Summitt off the hook either for this, because Pat Summitt tried to do everything right and above board, and I know she was committed to promoting the women's basketball game, but she wanted to promote it in a way that is not how you promote the game. Sorry, drama, salaciousness, and fun sells. Pat Summitt had a problem her whole career with when they play UConn, Geno Auriemma throwing shade the way he did at Tennessee. And for those who don't know, the first time the Lady Vols and UConn played, I'm actually pulling up the rivalry right now just so we can pull this up. But it wasn't initially a regular season rivalry. It became one because of things that were happening in the NCAA tournament. Tennessee was the established program. They'd won 3 national titles before UConn won their first national title. But the two first met in 1995. I believe that was UConn's first national title season. You guys can quote me on that. I'm looking it up now. But if I'm not mistaken, UConn's first national title season was the two met in 1995 when UConn won their first national title. They went 35-0 that year, and they just randomly met for a regular season matchup. UConn won the game 77-66. UConn was number 2. Tennessee was number 1. UConn ended up winning the national title. It was a huge matchup. It meant everything. They met later that year when UConn beat Tennessee in the NCAA tournament. That was for the national championship. So they met in the regular season, and then they met in the NCAA tournament, and in both instances, UConn won. That's really what sparked the rivalry, was that first year, because that ended up being the difference in the national title. That was the Rebecca Lobo year. That was the start of how the rivalry became. Tennessee lost 3 games that year. 2 were to UConn. The other one was in the SEC tournament to Vanderbilt, close one. So anyways, getting back to it, what happens the next year? Tennessee plays UConn at home and loses again. Okay, they lose again, and they lose 59-53. But Tennessee goes on to play UConn in the 1996 NCAA tournament in the Final Four and beats them 88-83 in overtime. A year later, Tennessee plays UConn and loses to them for the 3rd time in 4 years, 72-57. But in the NCAA tournament, Tennessee is a low 3 seed, not expected to win it, shocks UConn in the Elite 8 when UConn was undefeated as the number 1 overall team, and Tennessee goes to win the national title. That established the rivalry. UConn led the series 4-2, but Tennessee had won 2 NCAA tournament games against them. The UConn's 1, and the winner head-to-head of the last 3 in the NCAA tournament would go on to win the national championship. The rivalry was set in stone. Then you had Tennessee win 2 more, 98 and 99. You had UConn beat them in 2000, and then Tennessee beat the. I'm sorry, yeah, you had them split the series. Funny enough, they played twice in 2000, and Tennessee won in Connecticut, and UConn won in Knoxville, and then they played a 3rd time in the national title, which UConn won, and then became a period of where UConn was just knocking Tennessee out of the tournament every year. They played twice, 2 years in a row for the national title. Tennessee responded by getting Candace Parker. They beat UConn 3 years in a row, and then the series ended. Geno Auriemma, during all this time, as the rivalry was getting very heated, was throwing more and more shots at Pat Summitt, as he was the up-and-comer and Pat Summitt was the established coach. Pat Summitt didn't like that. She also didn't like Geno Auriemma's recruiting tactics. Geno Auriemma would take players, give them tours of ESPN. I mean, it is suspicious how many UConn graduates at that time got jobs at ESPN. And guess what? If you were a women's basketball player at that time, you had to think about your jobs after college, because the WNBA wasn't about to pay you that much, and the endorsements weren't going to come with it. So with that in mind, there were some recruiting tactics Pat Summitt didn't like. So Pat Summitt, after Geno Auriemma used those tactics to get Maya Moore into the series, because the rivalry became intensely about who you could get. Geno and Pat both intensely wanted Candace Parker, Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and the frustration, because women's college basketball during that time came down to who could get that best player, the generational player. And Pat Summitt ended the series. That was a very short-sighted move by Pat Summitt. I'm sorry. It was. It just propelled UConn to new heights, because Tennessee was benefiting from that series and that rivalry. UConn had more resources at the time, and Geno Auriemma was more cutting edge with this style of play, and it allowed UConn to take it to a whole nother level. And UConn unleashed a dynasty from between the period of 2007 and 2016, where I believe they won 6 national titles during that time, 3 undefeated seasons. So it was very, for all the things Pat Summitt did that were good for the women's game, her insistence on above board play and putting the entertainment value of a great rivalry behind her was a problem. And Geno seeing what he's seeing now was also a problem. And it shows how short-sighted some of the older coaches can be in promoting the game. It also shows how gaslighting Geno Auriemma is. Because an underrated part of this rivalry that would have made big news were they playing each other at the time, but they weren't, because the rivalry ended from Pat Summitt. And Tennessee wasn't as relevant at this moment, was 2016. For those who don't know, in 2016, when Pat Summitt tragically passed away, the year Pat passed away, Geno Auriemma, out of pure spite, kept Candace Parker off the Olympic team that year. Everybody tied to the program during the trials and auditions and practices were seeing Candace Parker was one of the 3 best players out there, clearly belonged, probably the best, was dominating everybody, and Geno Auriemma didn't pick her. Out of pure spite that Candace Parker didn't commit to him when he was coaching at UConn 13 years, well, he's still coaching at UConn, but that didn't commit to him 13 years earlier to UConn. I'm dead serious. You can look it up. He refused to sign Candace Parker out of pure spite. There was a Candace Parker curse facing Geno Auriemma because UConn had just completed its second straight undefeated season that year, dominating everybody, and Geno Auriemma hasn't won a national title since that year. So many people believe there is a Candace Parker curse for him leaving her off the team because that was disgusting and despicable. And he did it and made the decision within 2 months of Pat Summitt dying when it was clear that was going to happen. A sick, twisted move. And then he comes out and says this lie that the UConn rivalry became stupid. Well, hey, Geno, maybe it's stupid to leave Candace Parker off the Olympic team out of sheer pettiness that she committed to Tennessee. You're such a hypocrite for calling this rivalry stupid and saying that the fans were stupid when you purposely left a player off your team because they committed to Tennessee. And at that time, Tennessee and UConn hadn't been playing for 9 years and you were in the midst of 4 straight national titles. How in the world can you say the rivalry was stupid and call the fans stupid for that? See, this is why Geno is so utterly unlikable as a person. He's a liar and a hypocrite, and he's gaslighting everybody. He took the rivalry personally. I just said that Pat Summitt should have engaged in some of the feud in the back and forth. But Geno, as the new guy on campus, was notoriously throwing shots at Pat Summitt back and forth throughout the time they were going head-to-head because he was trying to promote UConn and get them on that level, and it worked. It's the same way Lane Kiffin was throwing shots when he was at Tennessee. Here's what this is like. Could you imagine who remembers all those shots Lane Kiffin was throwing at Florida in 2009 in football? It was a common thing. Could you imagine if Lane Kiffin kept throwing those shots and then Lane Kiffin started winning against Florida and they started going back and forth? And as Lane Kiffin started beating Florida, he comes up and he says, the rivalry got stupid and I just didn't like it. And our fans didn't like it either. Or if Steve Spurrier ever said that about the Tennessee-Florida rivalry. Spurrier never would have said that because Spurrier knew he was needling Tennessee. Geno was constantly needling Pat all the time. And again, I'm not knocking that. You should do that. You're trying to promote your program and the rivalry was good for the sport. But then for you to come back and say this rivalry was stupid because of the way people behaved on both sides, you were part of that behavior. You literally left one of the greatest players in Tennessee history, arguably the greatest player, off an Olympic team you were coaching specifically because she committed to Tennessee. And you did it when you guys hadn't played Tennessee in 9 years at that point and had clearly moved past Tennessee as a program. So who are you to say the rivalry became stupid? You act like such an elder statesman, and you're not. And it makes me sick. I hate creeps and I hate liars like that. I hate just it creeps me out. It grosses me out when someone pretends to be a statesman and they are just like the rest of us. It's just one of the most annoying things in anything. And so I got to be honest, he is such a liar on that. So that's the history of the Tennessee-UConn rivalry. I'm one of those people that doesn't think Pat Summitt is above blame here. Being way too much of a statesperson herself, and she was, because she actually acted like a statesperson. I think that she doesn't realize that she stalled the growth of the women's game because people wanted those rivalries. At the same time, I think that Geno pretending that the rivalry got stupid and blaming fans when he behaves certain ways to spike that rivalry is just absolutely one of the dumbest things I've ever heard anybody say, and one of the most hypocritical I've ever heard anybody say. So when Tim Caldwell and Geno Auriemma tip off tonight, it's kind of funny that Geno's going to come across as the old fuddy-duddy, out of touch with the game of women's college basketball and the entertainment. This is the same, by the way, when people with the Caitlin Clark saga right now in the WNBA, you see a bunch of sides on it. No one's taking this approach, and I'm taking this approach. Some of the hate for Caitlin Clark is stupid. It's irrational, and I don't think it's fair from other WNBA players. It's also great for the sport because you see, everybody says it's bad for the sport. They're killing their own cash cow. No, they're not. When you see Caitlin Clark get abused by other players on the court, and if she starts going back at them, you're going to see rivalries and people watch the games because they're either going to want to root for Caitlin Clark or against her, depending on how you feel about the situation. I think that the same thing can be held true for this. And Kim Caldwell is now the young gun. And the interesting thing about this is Kim Caldwell runs as out-entertained Geno Auriemma in what she runs. UConn was one of the first guard-oriented women's basketball programs. They still were ahead of the curve in that. You still have the Dawn Staleys of the world. UConn really went guard-oriented in tempo before anybody did in women's basketball. Kim Caldwell has decided, I'm going to take that up a totally different notch. And that's going to make one of the most exciting things to see in women's basketball, because now Kim Caldwell is the flashy young coach that Geno Auriemma was when this rivalry first started. And I'm just waiting on Geno Auriemma to pretend like he's above the rivalry again after, depending on what happens in this game. That's one of the most pathetic lies I've ever heard anybody say. I was just going to dive into the history of the rivalry, but when I read that quote from Geno Auriemma, it set me off on a tangent. For him to act like the rivalry was stupid, as if he didn't have a hand in that, was really, 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 really dumb. And I would say he's better than that, but he's not better than that. He's a pretty low-class guy.